As time progresses, the world of Final Fantasy grows ever larger. New expansions bring new areas, content, characters, and enemies. The story grows larger in scope and scale, and yet, as it grows, so too does it die. With each passing day, a blight creeps to the edges of 14's world, and Aetheris grows ever darker. The world of Final Fantasy XIV is dying. Hello Void, it's Eldon, and today I want to talk to you about Final Fantasy XIV. Now, I know with that intro it may seem like this is a lore video, but sadly it is not. If you want a lore theory, here's one. Calyx is trying to go to the Void. He doesn't really care about Alexandria or its citizens, nor about the Memory people. Instead, he wants to go to a place where his ambitions have already been realized to find a better way to eternal life than with the Endless. For more like that, like and subscribe. That being said, let's move on to what we're actually here to discuss today, and that is the story structure of Final Fantasy XIV. For you see, Final Fantasy XIV is dead. The world of Aetheris, Eorzea, all of it, is petrified, like a fossil, and it has been designed that way for quite some time. Both in its past, present, and future, Final Fantasy XIV finds itself stagnating, unable to make use of a lot of the strengths it could quite easily cultivate. The game has put itself in a position where it cannot capitalize on the strengths it ought to have, and that's a problem. 14 is constantly expanding. Every 2 years brings a new expansion, with new content and story to enjoy. But at the same time, 14 also forgets its path. With the beginning of each new expansion, the old expansion ends, and the areas and characters that expansion contained move into a phantom zone, unable to be properly utilized for the rest of time. They're locked away behind the arbitrary barriers set up by 14's current system. Allow me to explain. Every 14 expansion is designed around its specific expansion cycle. This includes things like enemy density, fate locations, hunts, etc. It populates its NPCs and terrain so that over the course of the expansion, the areas and content can be filled out. But what this means is that after the fact, it's hard to come back. It's hard to make new content in the old zones. So you'll often see that old zones are not utilized in new expansions. This issue is both strong and soft. Certainly, using old zones does have issues, but they do it from time to time. Square Enix can't really add new content to these zones, and neither do they want to. Each expansion incentivizes the team to work primarily in new areas, a tendency that isn't really bad, but does cause the patch content to grow somewhat stale and be somewhat forced. Regardless of the exact balance of complex reasons, the reality is the same. Old areas are rarely used, meaning that the vast majority of 14's world built up over the past decade is abandoned and isn't used in new content. Yet this minor issue with tendency is only the start, because there is one even greater issue with 14's areas. All areas are trapped in stasis. The truth of this is not covered, and if you think about it, it will become apparent, but Final Fantasy XIV does not have an instancing system. It does not have multiple versions of the same area. The most they can do is have some weather effects and changes in the skybox. Every area that you will enter will not change significantly for the rest of 14's existence. All the enemies there will be the same, shared and at the same level. All the geometry and buildings there will remain the same. This problem can be seen all over the game. If we look at ARR areas, there are still like 4 functioning castrums just sitting there years after the Empire's collapse, fully packed with Imperial soldiers and mechs. In Heavensward, Ishgardians still fight dragons despite that conflict ending in less than a full expansion cycle. In Stormblood, the Dome and Castle is still largely flooded and won't be rebuilt anytime soon. They do have the Dome and Enclave, which has functioned as the political center, but that is a patch solution that the devs had to make because they couldn't utilize the castle proper. This is a reality of 14, as it exists and has existed. Its restriction the game has to be built around. And to be fair, Square Enix has done a great job of building around it successfully. The main conceit of Shadowbringers is the unending day, which, once dispelled, makes each area feel new and changed. This effect is built around the weather system, which can be instanced per player, and here is utilized super effectively. The devs use this known limitation to create an actually interesting plot point, and it's wonderful. So wonderful, in fact, that they've done it 2 more times in the more recent expansions. Endwalker is built around the conflict of the final days, which takes the form of a massive fire in the sky and a bunch of weird creatures floating about in the air. In Dawntrail, the main concern of the second half is that there's a massive fleet of enemy ships hovering just outside the main city. So there are ways to turn this issue into a strength, but as time has progressed, it has become more and more of a limitation. 14 has begun to retread the same ideas, and with each new iteration it becomes less and less inspired. 14's story is of a grand scale, and it wants to see these large changes implemented across the world. It wants to make you feel like your actions have impact, and the current system is not designed to have that idea be turned into a reality. What it also means is that after we move on from an area, no new grand events can happen in that zone, both inside and outside the expansion. Those areas are forever locked in stasis. There will be no giant sword falling from the sky, there will be no hole ripped in space. All of 14's areas will remain as they are forevermore, locked in a timeless space where the events therein are both happening and past. This means that the story can never retread the same ground because it can't tell large stories in those areas. Outside of an instance here or there, it cannot make interesting content in old areas, and even those instances cannot leave a visible mark on the area that they occur in. Instead, 14 is limited to acting on a small scope outside of specific moments the game is designed around. The more you look for this issue, the more you can see the concessions made to accommodate these strict limitations. Dawntrail's second half is confined largely to 2 areas because they need to create both a Tyrol that is absent of Alexandrian technology and a complex world of Alexandria. So 4 zones are given to Tyrol and 2 to Alexandria, meaning the last half of Dawntrail is stuffed into effectively 2 zones of it. These restrictions of time also extend to characters. Once a character lives, they cannot stop living. The environmental NPCs that refer to them, the quests that they're built around, all of these rely on them being alive, so they are. They can't really be used in new events. People like Emmerich have a place in a static world and therefore cannot be brought into new stories, regardless of whether or not they might fit into them. The ability to use old characters that we know and love, that we have formed deep connections with, is halted, because the game cannot accommodate them being used in new ways. You cannot kill the Sultana because the city of Ul'dah would react to that, and the game is not designed to create an Ul'dah that has reacted to the Sultana's death. And even if they could create a new Ul'dah, it would create dissonance for players who had not yet gotten to that point in the story. And that makes it so much easier to just not do that. I'm not saying that these types of stories become impossible under the current system. I only assert that they are disincentivized to the point of never being written at all. Yoshi P and the 14 team are masters of cost analysis. That's how they got ARR out of 1.0, by being strict and necessary with their costs. What this means is that when there is an option of telling a story that does not overcome these challenges versus spending a lot of time and money to overcome them, the 14 team invariably chooses not to. And so we are stuck with these issues. It locks off so much, not with a hard barrier, but with an amount of work that is not worth overcoming. This creates a scenario where with each new expansion, 14 must capture lightning in a bottle. They cannot rely on their past to push them forward in any meaningful way, and instead must consistently push forward. With each new expansion, they have to create something better than they did before, without relying on what they've built up over the past decade. And that is not something that can be easily done, especially when you've hit such highs in the past. coming out with a new fine thing doesn't really cut it. And that goal of something incredible becomes even more difficult as time goes on because of what 14 has decided to do with their present expansion design. That's right, this is a double feature. Not only are we talking about the problems 14 has accessing its past, but the problems 14 has utilizing its present. The world of 14 is dying, not just in previous expansions, for, you see, current expansions have wilted under the strain of expectation. Allow me to elaborate. With each new expansion comes a new breadbasket of content. When we look inside, we can see some of the things are stable. We get 8 dungeons, 6 of which are part of the MSQ, 2 of which are additional max level dungeons. We get a new raid tier, 1 releasing at the start of the expansion, the rest coming out over time. 1 new alliance raid, 3 trials, 1 just before level X5, 1 just before level X0, and 1 at max level. And finally, we get a long MSQ consisting of 6 new areas and 10 levels. This is a lot of stuff we know we're getting. There are some other interesting things that may or may not come out, an exploration zone, some new twists on old content like variant dungeons or chaotic raids. Ultimates are generally pretty fun, though if you look at these unknown pieces of content, you'll notice that much of them are niche. They don't integrate with the main content offered by 14, that being the roulette system. And so we come to the issue. I'm not here to talk necessarily about content diversity in 14. I play a good amount of the game on my own, but I'm not really wanting to dive headlong into higher end content. But what I can talk about is how this very full breadbasket makes it difficult for 14 to tell a competent story. When there's so much stuff an MSQ must include, the MSQ becomes harder to write. The pace of the story, the events therein, all of it is measured out before the story is ever even conceived of. We know so much about what's going to happen, what we will probably feel when those things are happening, how often the stakes will be raised, and even how the tension will be drawn out. Any amount of surprise or interest there tends to fade away. Let's take dungeons, for example. Ever since Shadowbringers, Final Fantasy XIV has introduced the trust system. This means that for each new dungeon, a group of NPC supporters will be available to help people get through it. This is generally a pretty good idea. A decent system that allows players who don't want to interact with queues or who get nervous when grouping with real people to experience the content on their own. An admirable goal, especially for a game so story-focused. What it also means is that for every single dungeon we encounter in each of the patches and each of the MSQs, there must be a group of 3 or more NPCs of very specific jobs for when we encounter the dungeons. Every single time we encounter an area that acts as an escalation of tension or a resolution of stakes, we must be accompanied by a very specific amount of people with very specific professions. Additionally, as you're playing through, once that very specific group is assembled, you understand that the next thing coming up is going to be a dungeon. When in Elpis, a land before our scope of time, we meet up with Vana and finally form a party of 4 people, we know that the dungeon is coming. It's inevitable. This restriction on its own isn't necessarily a problem. What really becomes problematic is when it has to be implemented across every conceivable story beat, at least 6 times an expansion, and in every single patch quest. We can't have a scenario where we have small moments with just one character. Instead, we need to shoehorn in jobs of every type into every scenario. Fortunately, 14 does have a more party-based structure, which can mitigate the issues with this, but it doesn't change the fact that it being a necessity is a problem. And this sort of predictability in storytelling plagues almost every other aspect of 14's MSQ design. Every trial has to be set up for a specific level, so that after the second dungeon, you can expect a guaranteed escalation of stakes into a trial. For patches, now that trials are included in patch quests instead of their own side quest, we find 2 structures for patches, either an open early start with lots of talking and probably a random side mission into a dungeon trial combo, or an early dungeon with some malarkey in the middle, followed by a trial. As soon as you pass the third quest without seeing a dungeon, you know that it's going to be the former. Or if you get surprised by an early dungeon, and by surprised by an early dungeon, I of course mean surprised by a group of 3 people teaming up before an early dungeon, then you know that the trial is going to happen later. And we'll probably use the dungeon as an exploratory zone. This kind of strict formatting is less egregious in raids because raids tend to use the format as a prompt. For instance, Arcadian sets you up as a fighter going up against a series of matches, which generally works really well for what it needs to be, which is an introduction to 4 new fights every tier with cool people to talk to. But when we get into the MSQ, the main offering of 14, and something that should be interesting, engaging, and new, we find that the rigid formatting prevents us from having a unique experience. The closest thing you'll ever get to something unique in a 14 MSQ is the instances, and those are made at a tremendously high cost with little to no replayability, meaning that 14 is disincentivized from creating a lot of instances. So it's a catch-22. All of the things that 14 has included in its MSQ so that they are more popular have made the MSQ worse. Not necessarily worse, but certainly harder to write, and a story that is harder to write is a story that is more likely to be bad. So what are we going to do about it? What do we do now that we can see how 14 is afflicted in both its past and present? Well, sadly, this is where I don't have many good solutions. It's important, of course, to be aware of the problems that occur and to correctly address them. As time goes on and we get more tired of the repeated patterns that show up, these issues will become more and more apparent and more real issues than simple observations. So it's important that we point them out now. But as far as actually fixing them, I don't really have actionable solutions. Not because there aren't any solutions, but because I don't know where the budget lies. I'm not a 14 developer, I don't know how the game is actually made, nor what solutions would be preferable. Therefore, I can't make real advice. What I can do, however, is throw out a few solutions just cuz. Call it a thought exercise, more than an actual attempt to solve the problem. Let's start with the problem of past expansion areas. For this issue, I see only 3 viable solutions, though each one has its own downsides. The first, and perhaps best, would be to overhaul the current system to allow for variation within instances of an area. This would generally be very helpful for a lot of new content, as well as allowing older areas to be re-entered into the story seamlessly and in very interesting ways. The problem with this is that it would no doubt be incredibly expensive, and even with the amount of doors it would open, perhaps would not be worth the cost of achieving this. To do this, 14 would have to overhaul large portions of its engine or systems, which would cause a whole slew of issues and drive attention away from development in ways that probably aren't what we want to see. The next solution would be to create a distinct point in time, a new point from which all previous points are in the past and all current points exist in the present. This would allow us to go back to old areas at the new point with a new version of the area and the old version accessible at the same time. We would have, for instance, 2 Ishgards exist simultaneously, one in the war and one beyond it. There is also the possibility of creating a point in the future where all the stuff that exists now is the present and there's like an alternate future that we can visit. Both are certainly possible, but they both similarly run the risk of feeling weird, like the game has all of a sudden gotten a lot smaller, even if it stays the same size. It also requires a lot of work on the front end, making essentially entirely new versions of existing areas. The final and perhaps best solution is to do nothing. Not change any system significantly, nor make any changes to how it currently exists. This does not necessarily mean that nothing would change going forward. It would simply require a shift in the design philosophy of 14. 14 ought to abandon the notion that all of this exists at the same time, instead allowing for dissonance, for contradictions to exist within the game. One quest can reference the Sultana being alive, while the next references her death. If they really want to, they can go back through and add or change existing dialogue to accommodate it, but I don't necessarily recommend it. It seems like a lot of work that would disincentivize the use of old areas and old characters. If we allow the game to evolve, to shift, to change without erasing the past, that should be fine. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue of events not really being able to occur in old areas, but that could be solved with some combination of the previous two solutions in a limited sense. Now, to address the problem of 14's stagnant content, what really ought to happen is a similar shift in philosophy. 14 should probably reprioritize its ideas for how it structures its content inside of an expansion. I think it's good that a lot of new content is brought into the MSQ and therefore promoted. Most people will play the new dungeons, most people will play the new trials. But it becomes a problem when that convenience is turned into a requirement. When slavish devotion to including all of this stuff in the MSQ gets in the way of the MSQ being writable, then it ought to be done away with. 14 should prioritize its story, which, for my money, is the most alluring feature, and allow the writers to create a structure around which the game and its content can be built. Now, the timelines for this are not clean, nor is this necessarily a surefire solution, but it would go a long way to seeing the game and the story fall into a less predictable state of affairs. One other idea that I've heard going around, which also could help this issue, is if we end leveling at 100. A lot of the structure of 14 is built around the necessity of leveling, of having dungeons as the primary leveling system and spacing them out enough so that you can have a seamless transition up the ladder. If we no longer have to do leveling, then there's not necessarily a reason for the dungeons to all be lined up so evenly. We can abandon this incredibly rigid structure and move to something more flexible. I still imagine that developers would like to spread out content evenly enough to keep people engaged, having them space dungeons and trials to break up the flow, but with a change away from it being a structural necessity for advancement in the game, it opens up a whole bunch of doors for unique changes and alterations that would allow 14 to recapture some of the magic it has when it is a less known quantity. Overall, I think these issues, while certainly true, are minor and, more importantly, very solvable. We are not anywhere near the point of no return, and 14 can work to fix its dead world, to reflect and to refurbish the parts it has abandoned and bring new life to all of the possibilities it buried long ago. I do see a bright future ahead for 14, especially if things continue to change for the better. If the devs continue to listen and continue to feel a fire under them to make the game better than it has been before. Perhaps we will never see a story as good as Shadowbringers, one that works so well inside the format it was given. But if we break away from that format, we could perhaps see a new kind of story even better. And that's my hope. Anyway, that's all I have. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or if you just feel like it. I'm not your boss. If you have any problems with the things I said, or any more thoughts about them, leave them in the comments. I'll read them. I won't respond. I do try to be a monolith, but I will certainly read them. Wishlist my game on Steam, it's probably in the description. Yada yada yada, etc. Anyway, Void, it's a long road out there, so take it easy. Elden out.